أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. So I have a few moments with you. They actually added time. That doesn't usually happen, but they added time for me. And I have a few things that I want you, inshallah, to take home with you. First of all, I think there is a very serious problem in the way that we are teaching our children about Islam. I think there is a very serious problem in the way we are raising our children in Islam. I think there is a very serious problem in the way that our schools are teaching our children about Islam. And I'll explain what I think that problem is. But before I talk about the problem, I want to quote a hadith to you in which Aisha is said to have, we know that Aisha radiallahu anha says that if the first verses to be revealed said, do not drink alcohol, the people would have said, we will never leave alcohol. If the first verses to be revealed said, do not commit zina, the people would have said, we will never leave zina. Now I want to note, who are these people that Aisha radiallahu anha is referring to? She is referring to some of the greatest people to walk the earth. She is referring to companions. And yet she says, and this is very, very important, she is teaching us a principle about human nature. And that principle is, you cannot start with the harams. You cannot start with the do's and don'ts of Islam. She explains that the first verses to be revealed were about building an attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you study the Quran, you find that there are two phases of the revelation. There is the phase in Mecca. These were the first verses. And then there is the phase in Medina. This is the second phase. And when you study the Meccan verses and you compare it to the Madani verses, you find that the subject matter is very different. The first verses to be revealed did not talk so much about rules. The first verses did not talk about fiqh and haram and halal so much. The first verses were about who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is my responsibility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? I will meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You'll notice that the Meccan verses, for example, Juz Amma, the Meccan verses are about the Day of Judgment. The Meccan verses are about who is Allah. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Allahu Samad. Say that Allah is one. That He doesn't need anyone else and everyone needs Him. That He is not born and He does not give birth and there is nothing that's even close to anything like Him. Tawheed. So the first verses are creating a foundation for these people of who is Allah and when will I meet Allah, and when I meet Allah, what's going to happen? That is the foundation that the Prophet ﷺ's mission was building. And then after that foundation was built, as soon as the laws started to come down, the people all responded with what? Sami'na wa ata'na. We hear and we obey. Here is the problem of how we're doing it wrong. Many of us, we grow up learning about Islam as if Islam is nothing but a list of haram things to do, haram things to eat, haram things to wear. And that's Islam. We teach this to children, and that's all we teach them. We teach them about hellfire before they can even understand the concepts. We teach them about Allah's wrath and anger before they can even understand or pronounce Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. We're teaching upside down. We're teaching from the outside in instead of from the inside out. And this is wrong because Aisha radiallahu anha herself is saying that had they begun with the outside, with the rules, before there was an attachment and love for Allah, before they had taqwa, before they had built this relationship, I want you to think about the person in your life that you love most. Everyone loves someone, yeah? The person that you love most in your life. And I want you to imagine that that person comes to you and says, I really want you to do this for me. If you love someone and they say jump, you say, how high? That's the nature of love. And so what happens is, if children are taught to first love Allah, to first know who Allah is, to first have healthy taqwa, healthy fear. And I say healthy fear because there is healthy fear and there is unhealthy fear. There is healthy fear and there is shame. And I'll explain the difference because it is an essential difference. But if someone has healthy love for Allah, a healthy attachment, and they've grown up learning who Allah is and who Allah really is, because the way we are teaching our children about Allah is upside down. It's wrong. We teach about Allah as if Allah is more anger than He is mercy. We teach about Allah as if He is more wrath than He is forgiveness. And that's wrong, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Himself that my mercy supersedes my wrath. My mercy is above my wrath. But is that the way we are learning? Is that the way we grew up? We are teaching about Allah as if, wa'a'udhu billah, Allah is like a police officer who's just waiting for you to mess up so He can throw you in jail. And of course that jail is forever and it's called Jahannam, hellfire. This is wrong and this is pushing people away from Islam. Because what happens if you tell a child that Allah is going to punish you if you mess up? If you tell a child that the moment you make a mistake, you're going to go to hell, Allah will be angry, Allah is wrathful, do you know what's going to happen to that child? It's like telling a child every single day, be careful of the police. Be careful not to mess up. Sometimes you actually have to tell your kids this, but police are a different story. Be careful. If you mess up, this is what's going to happen to you. This is what they're going to do to you. This is what can happen. Now, as that child grows up, how is the relationship between that child and the police going to look like? Is that child going to want to be really close to the police? When the child sees the police, are they going to run to the police for help? Yes or no? Is that child going to reach out to the police and want to have a close relationship? And the answer is no, because you have taught that child that the police is out to get them. You've taught that child that the moment you mess up, the police is going to catch you. And so that child is going to live their life trying to avoid the police. Now imagine if you teach your child that Allah is like the police. That you teach your child Allah's just waiting for you to mess up and then you're going to go to jail. But this is called Jahannam and it's forever. And so that child grows up and just doesn't want to have anything to do with religion. That child grows up trying to avoid Allah instead of getting closer to Allah. And that's why a lot of what I want to talk about today is not just learning, but unlearning. We need to unlearn a lot of the concepts that we grew up with about who Allah is. Many of us were taught that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is waiting for us to slip, and that He's very harsh, and that if we mess up, that's it for us. Now I want to give you guys an example. And that example is the example of the GPS. And I use this example because, inshallah, you'll never forget it. I want you to imagine that you get in the car and you punch in the address. How many of you have ever driven, and how many of you have ever made a wrong turn while you're driving? Let me put it this way. How many of you have never in your life made a wrong turn while you're driving? No one, right? One time I asked this question and I had someone raise their hand and I asked them how old they were and they said they were 8. So there's that. The point is that if you've ever gotten behind the wheel, if you've ever tried to drive, you have made wrong turns. Now I want you to imagine that the moment you make a wrong turn, the GPS says to you, "You worthless driver. Honestly, you have already made 25 wrong turns today. I'm keeping track. And I think that you're a worthless driver. And I think that you should stop trying to drive because you make too many mistakes. And you should park up over there and stop trying to drive." You laugh, I think, because I can't see your faces. Because that's so ridiculous, right? And if the GPS did that, no one would ever get to their destination. But let me put it this way. Many of us as parents act like this crazy GPS. The moment our child makes a wrong turn, we call them out, not to redirect them, but to tell them that they're bad, to tell them that they're not good drivers. When they make a mistake, we tell them it's because they're a bad son or a bad daughter or a bad Muslim. And the problem with that is called shame. And shame doesn't motivate. Shame does the opposite. Shame makes a person want to give up. Because if I tell someone, "You know what? You're just bad at driving. You've made so many wrong turns. I think you should stop trying to drive." Then it makes them want to stop trying. Now, my question to you is, what does the GPS do when you make a wrong turn? Anyone? Recalculating, rerouting. Basically, the GPS is a non-judgment zone. You can make 1,000 wrong turns, and the GPS will never say that you're a worthless driver. The GPS will never say you're a bad driver. The GPS has only one job, and that is to reroute you, to help you get back on the right track. Now, my question to you is this. How about as parents, we be more like the GPS? That when our children, when our young people make mistakes, when they get off track, instead of shaming them, instead of telling them that they're worthless sons and daughters and wives and husbands and Muslims, how about we just reroute and help them to make that U-turn? When you look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how does Allah speak to sinners? I want you to think about this. And I want you to compare how Allah speaks to sinners, the people who have made wrong turns. And I want you to compare how Allah speaks to sinners and how we speak to sinners. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِي الَّذِينَ أَصْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah here is addressing sinners. He says, say, oh my slave. Do you know that there is no more endearing way for Allah to address us than Ya ibadi, my slave? He's telling the sinner, you're mine. You're my slave. And then he says, لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله. Do not despair of the mercy of Allah. This is how Allah speaks to sinners. This is how Allah addresses the person who has gone off track. Now compare that to how we speak to our children when they go off track, when they mess up, when they fall short of our expectations. How we speak to sinners in the community, in our families. And you see why we have a problem in our community. We shame sinners. We don't try to reroute sinners. When you see someone drowning, imagine you're at the beach and you see someone who's drowning. What do? Well, I guess you could call your friends and say, man, look at that person. They can't even swim. They're such bad swimmers. Why are they? And then yelling out to them, you know, I noticed that you're a really bad swimmer. I noticed that you're struggling here. You might as well just stop trying to swim and drown. But this is exactly what we do to people who are struggling. How many times have you heard statements like, she might as well take off her hijab? Or why is this person even pretending that they're so religious? Why are they trying? It's as if we're telling people who are drowning, stop trying to swim. And instead of reaching out to help them and reaching out to direct them or lend a hand, we're really good at judgment. We judge them. We'll call one another and we'll gossip about them. I mean, you're basically calling your friends and you're like, look at that guy, look at that girl who's drowning. Man, they're really bad at swimming. But you're not doing anything to help. And this is the problem. Sometimes we even pick up stones and we throw it at them. They're already drowning. They're already struggling. And what do we do as a community and as parents and as educators and as leaders and as imams and as shuyukh and sheikhas? We throw stones. We judge. We shame. And I don't have to tell you that that's not going to help them swim. So what we need to do is we need to go back to the prophetic model. The prophetic model is to lay a foundation, first and foremost, when your children are young, in the love of Allah. Who is Allah? Knowing who Allah is as the most merciful before the one who has wrath. Allah's wrath is real. Allah's anger is real. Allah's Jahannam is real, and we ask Allah for protection from these things. But we absolutely do not teach in this upside down fashion, where we start with the rules, we start with the punishment, when that person has not even built a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remember Aisha's words. She said that if the first verses to be revealed said don't drink alcohol, the people would have rejected it. They would have said, no, we're not going to give up alcohol. If it was don't commit zina, they would have said, no, we're not going to leave zina. But the first verses were not about haram and halal. The first verses were about La ilaha illallah. Who is Allah? What is the day of judgment? What am I going to be asked? How much has Allah given me? And how much do I owe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? When you build that kind of attachment to Allah, guess what happens? Fast forward. Now, when the command came to give up alcohol, they poured it out in the streets immediately. Now when the command came for hijab, they took any type of cloth to cover themselves. You know, many of them were culturally already covering their head, but they were not covering their chest. They took that covering and they covered their chest. Immediate submission. Why? Because they already had an attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you love someone, they say jump, you say how high. That is sami'na wa ata'na, we hear and we obey. We have to build love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our children. And we have to build mercy and compassion and not shame. We have to be a people who, when we see someone drowning, we reach out to help them rather than judging, rather than shaming. That when somebody has made a wrong turn, especially our children, because that is our amana, that's our responsibility. That when our children make wrong turns, it is our responsibility to help reroute them, not to judge them, not to shame them. Because shame makes people want to stop trying. Shame makes people want to give up and run away from Allah. And here I want to talk about the difference between healthy remorse, healthy fear, and unhealthy shame. Healthy remorse is when I say, Ya Allah, I made a mistake. Ya Allah, I'm human and I made a mistake, and I acknowledge my mistake humbly. I go to Allah in humility and I say I made a mistake and I admit my mistake, just like Adam did. Remember, Adam ate from the tree when she was not allowed. But what did he say after he made that mistake? He said, رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. He said, our Lord, we wronged our own selves. So he is being humble. He is admitting his mistake. And by the way, he is not deflecting the blame. We all know that shaitan deceived him and Hawa. Allah tells us, فَأَزَلَّهُمْ الشَّيْطَانِ, that shaitan made them slip. Both of them. By the way, it wasn't Hawa, it wasn't Eve who made Adam slip. We know in the Quran that it was Iblis, shaitan, who made them both slip. فَأَزَلَّهُمَ الشَّيْطَانِ, plural. Shaitan made them both slip. So he could have deflected the blame to shaitan, but he doesn't do that. He takes responsibility for his mistake. And he says, رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا. Our Lord, we did this to ourselves. We wronged our own selves. But in the same moment, he continues to have hope in Allah's mercy. وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. And if you do not forgive us and have mercy on us, we will be among the losers. So I want you to study this dua and to understand that Allah has taught us this dua and this story so that it would be a blueprint for us. Why? Don't you think that Allah could have told us about all these other things that happened to Adam in his life? Don't you know Adam lived a long time? And yet Allah chooses to tell us about the slip. He's not even telling us about all the times he got it right, which I'm sure was a lot. He's telling us about his slip, his mistake. Why? Well, number one, so that we realize that we're also going to slip. And we realize that we are Bani Adam, we are the children of Adam, and we will make mistakes, and we will slip. And we are fallible, and we aren't perfect, and we aren't angels. So this is a lesson for us, number one. Number two, it's to create a blueprint. It's to create a blueprint of what to do when we slip, when our children slip, when our friends and family slip. رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. He takes responsibility. He does not deflect the blame on shaitan. He doesn't say shaitan made me do it. Shaitan's fault. He says we did this because they had a choice. But he has hope in the mercy of Allah. And guess what happens next? Listen carefully. What happens next is Allah forgave them. And then Allah sent Adam to this earth as a prophet. Have you ever reflected on this? It was after he slipped and was forgiven that he was sent as a prophet. Isn't that deep? Because a lot of times we think, oh, I slipped, that's it for me, right? We give up. There's no redemption. I messed up. We think as though Allah is all or none, right? You gotta be perfect or else give up. This is a shaitani trap. Shaitan wants you to think that it's all or none. Shaitan wants you to give up the moment you fall. Because that's how he's gonna get you. Because we all fall. We all mess up. But Allah wants us to learn how to get back up. So what is Allah teaching us? He's teaching us you will slip, just like your father did. You will make mistakes, but here is how to get back up. And that is what we need to teach our children. We need to be able to teach them how to fall and get back up. We don't want our kids to fall. Have you ever seen a child when they're learning to walk? Do you want your 1-year-old to fall? Anyone want their 1-year-old to fall? No, y'all aren't crazy, right? You don't want your kid to fall. But it is an inevitable part of dunya. It's called gravity. Have you ever known of a child who never fell? Raise your hand. A child who never, ever fell. A human being who's never fallen in their entire life. Do you get my point? And so we don't want our children to fall, but we have to teach them how to get back up. Think about the Olympics for a second. A good trainer isn't gonna say, just don't fall. Well, it's obvious. You know, the Olympic trainer doesn't want the gymnast to fall, right? Is that obvious? Yeah? But a good trainer doesn't just say, just don't fall. Just don't fall. A good trainer says, do your best. Not to fall, but here's how you get back up. Do you get it? And as parents, we have to be trainers for our children. We don't want our children to fall, but we have to teach them how to get back up. And if I were to say, if there's anything that is absolutely debilitating our community, it's that we don't have this skill. We don't know how to fall and get back up. Because the moment we fall, we have all of this shame. And the shame says, you're bad. You're a bad Muslim. You're a bad daughter. You're a bad wife. You're a bad husband. You're a bad son. And so we give up. We have a lot of unlearning to do. And this is one of those things that we need to unlearn. Who is Allah? And how can we teach our children how to reroute when they get off track? But before I end, I want to talk about something else that we need to unlearn. And that is a concept that many of us have heard, and that is the concept of sabr. Sabr. What is sabr? Well, sabr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, is something so beautiful that He rewards for sabr with no limit. Sabr is something Allah loves. But I will tell you this, talking to people all over the world, I can tell you that of all the issues that people message me about or speak to me about, there is an underlying common denominator. An underlying common denominator. And do you know what that is? That underlying common denominator is that we spend too long in bad situations. I'm going to repeat that. We spend too long in bad situations. Now, the question is why? The question is, why do we do that? I'll give you an analogy to explain. Imagine that you wake up one day and you realize that your house is on fire. Your house is on fire. And you look at that fire and you say, I'm not going to do anything about this fire because I have so much sabr. In fact, this fire is the qadr of Allah. Allah is testing me with this fire, and therefore I'm going to go back to sleep because of my sabr. I'm going to stand in this burning house and I'm going to watch it burn because of my sabr. And then we will have people from the community and family come around and say, MashaAllah, look at their sabr. They stood in a burning house for so many years and they didn't do anything. MashaAllah, sabr, sabr, sabr. Does anyone see the problem here? And then we say, no. Stay in the burning house and keep your children in the burning house for the sake of your children. Do I need to repeat it? Keep your children in the burning house for the sake of your children. And that's absolutely what we're fed. And then we call it sabr. Now I'm going to state the obvious here. If your house is on fire, what should you do? Call the fire department. Get a fire extinguisher. Am I right? Everyone with me? You try to stop the fire. Now, in case you aren't getting my subtle analogy, I am referring to an abusive home. That when there is abuse in a home, that house is on fire. Now, if a house is on fire, we try to save the house first. We try to get help. We call the fire department. We get people involved to stop the fire and save the home. Are you with me? We get fire extinguisher, but we must take action. And sabr, if your house is on fire, means calling the fire department, taking a fire extinguisher, doing something to save the home and the people inside the home, namely your children who are your amana. They are your trust. And I promise you 1.5 times that children who grow up in burning houses suffer for the rest of their lives. They suffer for the rest of their lives. And unfortunately, they grow up to perpetuate that abuse. Because here's what happens. When you grow up in a burning home, one of two things happens, typically. Unless there is intervention to remove the child from the burning house, or there is very serious therapy. Without intervention, when a child grows up in a burning house, one of two things happens. They either marry abusers or they become abusers. They either marry abusers or they become abusers. Why? Because this is human nature. We model what we grew up with. And so boys become their fathers. I'll repeat that one. Boys become their fathers. Unless there is intervention or very serious therapy, boys become their fathers. And so I always try to tell women, make sure that whoever you marry or stay married to is who you want your son to become, because he will, unless there is intervention or serious therapy. Second, mothers, you are modeling for your daughters. Let me explain what that means. Anytime I meet a woman who is in a very toxic, abusive situation, and she's staying there, and she isn't taking action, and she isn't reaching out or calling the fire department, getting a fire extinguisher, that she believes that it is sabr to stay in the burning house quietly. Most of the time, she saw her mother do the same thing. She watched her mother model this behavior as what it means to be a woman, as what it means to be a wife and a mother, as what it means to have sabr. I met a woman who told me her mother said to her, you should be able to drink poison and keep a smile on your face. This is what we're teaching our children. And this is trauma. And this is the result of generational trauma that we have to stop. But it will continue, and I promise you, it will continue when children grow up in burning homes. It continues to the next generation until someone puts a stop to it. Until someone says it stops with me, I'm breaking the cycle, and I'm gonna heal myself. The best thing you can do for your children is to heal yourself, is to break that cycle of generational trauma, is to take yourself and your family out of burning homes if the fire doesn't stop. I repeat, I'm not talking about don't try. You know, I put up a post recently. I thought it was such a profound quote. The quote basically says, what if I told you that I can tell how much you love yourself by who you take as a partner? I can tell how much you love yourself by who you take as a partner. The question is, how would that make you feel? Would you feel proud? Would you feel embarrassed? What would that say about you? And I had a lot of comments that were quite typical, but comments like, oh, come on, people change. Absolutely, people can change. But here's the thing. Number one, and as studying psychology and dealing with people around the world, number one rule for people to change is they have to want to change. Got that? You can't want it for them on their behalf. A person can change if they want to change. But drowning yourself is not gonna save a drowning person. And I feel like I need to say this really, really loud and clear, especially for us women. Because many of us believe this. We think if I can just, crucify myself enough, if I can just drown myself enough, if I can just erase myself enough, then maybe that person will change. That if I can drown myself, if I can kill myself, and when I say kill, I mean it very literally, because we are making ourselves sick. I want you to know, and this is another discussion, that chronic stress actually makes you sick. So it's not just metaphoric. It's not just I'm depressed and I'm anxious, but as if that's not enough. But you're physically actually killing yourself as well, because you physically get sick. But this is what we believe. We think if I can just drown myself enough, I can save another person who's drowning. And that's not how it works. The person has to want to change. And so if someone wants to change, that's great. Get help. Get help. That's part of your worship. Get counseling. Get therapy. But if someone does not want to change, and you have tried to stop the fire, and the fire continues and maybe even increases, then what do you do in a burning house? Not rocket science, guys. Run, don't walk. Not rocket science. Fire, try to put out the fire. Try to get people involved. Try to get intervention. If the fire continues, run, don't walk. And that shouldn't have to be said. But unfortunately, we have a lot of toxic culture. We have a lot of toxic culture. And I will tell you this right now, it is not Islam. It is not Islam. Islam says, if you are in a burning house, try to stop the fire. But if you cannot, never, ever allow yourself and your children to burn. Okay? That's not Islam. That is toxic culture. And I want to remind you and myself that any aspect of culture, whether that culture is Western culture or Eastern culture, any aspect of culture that contradicts Islam must be rejected. Any aspect, whether it's from the East or from the West, if it contradicts our deen, we must reject it. The Prophet ﷺ said, if you see something wrong, you must try to change it with your hand. He does not say, go back to sleep. He does not say, have sabr and do nothing. He does not say, sabr is to be passive. He says, try to change it with your hand. And if you cannot, then try to change it with your tongue. And if you cannot, then at least hate it in your heart. And this is the weakest of faith. We are not a people who are silent about abuse or oppression. That's not our deen. The Prophet ﷺ said, help your brother if he is an oppressor or he's oppressed. So the companion said, well, we know how to help if he's oppressed, but how do we help when he is the oppressor? And the Prophet ﷺ said, by stopping him from oppressing. That's how you help an oppressor. You cannot allow oppression to continue. You take action to try to stop it, or you remove yourself and your family if it doesn't stop. And so there's a lot of not just learning that we need to do, who is Allah, what is sabr, but there's also a lot of unlearning that we need to do. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow this generation to be the generation that breaks these toxic cycles and comes back to our deen as what drives us, instead of cultures that are absolutely against Islam. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم سبحانك الله وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. I think I have, so basically I have a flight to catch. So I have probably 10 minutes. Yeah, 10 minutes. I requested that I would allow time to take questions. So inshallah, if you have a question, Buna,
yes.
can you give them directions?
I will. So if you have any questions, questions right here, Ustad. We don't have to go far. Bismillah, go ahead, sister.
Assalamu alaikum. Okay, I had a question regarding, we grew up in toxicity. It's been divorced for about 6 years now. We were watching a reel a couple days ago that if you cut any ties with your parents, you'll never go to Jannah.
Yep.
So my concern was that my daughters cut off their father because he's starting now to be verbally abusive with them. And I don't know, I watched that reel and I didn't know, they said there's no exception, you can't cut the ties with your parents. or you'll never see Jannah.
Oh, wow. Okay. Bismillah. So I'm glad you asked that question because every single seminar I give, pretty much without fail, that's the first question. And that is, what if the abuse or the toxicity is from a family member that we can't cut off? Then what? So, Bismillah, this is a very difficult question and it's a very difficult test. But I'm going to first lay some principles. And of course, beyond that, it is a case-by-case basis, all right? But some principles that we have in our deen. Number one, Allah says in the last ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah says that Allah never puts a burden, a responsibility on anyone beyond what they can bear. All right? لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Meaning, Allah will never make it obligatory upon you to do something that is beyond what you can bear. So this is the first principle. Now, to explain this principle, I'm going to give you an example. Are we required to fast in Ramadan? It's not a trick question, yes or no? Yes. Don't you need to fast in order to go to Jannah, essentially? It's one of the 5 pillars. You know, it's very important, yes? But what happens in the case of someone who, if they were to fast, they would die? Special case, someone has a health condition, they're on life-saving medication that they cannot give up, etc., or they cannot fast for whatever reason, they would die. This is an extreme example. In that case, is that person required to fast? No. In fact, it would be wrong for that person to fast. It would be forbidden to fast if it was going to kill them. So this is the principle. Now, how does that apply here? Just like fasting, silat al-rahim, keeping the ties of kinship, is so important. It is so essential in Islam. However, if there is direct harm, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not ask us to do something that will bring direct harm. So now, having said that, that's a general principle. But having said that, it is still a case-by-case basis because not every situation is different. In some cases, there can be boundaries without complete cutoff to protect from harm. In some cases, you can get mediators involved, you can get counselors, you can get family to try to intervene, to try to rectify, counseling, psychologists, etc. So what I say to you is this is the principle. And then beyond that, it depends on, case by case. But the principle is there. We try our utmost best to keep the ties of kinship. We try our utmost best to show ihsan, excellence to our family, but not at the expense of abuse or harm. And so how you navigate that in your particular situation is going to be case by case. But my advice is to get people involved, to get help, to get counselors, mediators, family, to try to stop the fire and save the home.
Jazakallah khair. Ustad, we had one more question actually. A sister asked me to ask on her behalf. She said that she has been going through some depression and not being able to really focus in her salah. So she's asking if you have any advice on if a person feels like perhaps they're going through something or they're a little distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how can they reconnect in their salah?
Okay, really great question. This is a question that I tried to write an entire book about. It's called Healing the Emptiness. And this book is about when I'm suffering, how can I first figure out what is the core or the root cause of my suffering? Because a lot of us, what we do when we're suffering is we look for a way to numb the pain. We look for a way to escape the pain. We look for a way to lift up the carpet and sweep it under that rug. But that's not going to make it go away. If a person has a gunshot wound and they cover up that wound with a Band-Aid, does it disappear? No. And over time, what happens to that wound? It can actually become infected. It will affect the entire body. This is what happens when we have unhealed wounds. Some of us are experiencing depression today. Some of us don't realize that our depression and our anxiety and our panic attacks and our trust issues today are rooted in childhood trauma. And most of it is rooted in childhood trauma. And it's trauma and wounds that we just never addressed. We covered up the gunshot wound with a Band-Aid and we said, what wound? But it doesn't disappear. And so what we have to start to do is recognizing the root cause of our suffering. You're not depressed for no reason. You're depressed for a reason. And the depression is actually an alarm for you. I make the analogy in the book that depression itself, pain itself, anxiety itself is like a smoke alarm. It's indicating to you that there's a fire somewhere in your life. It's telling you there's something wrong. There's something that you need to address. There's something that you need to heal. But what happens is that many of us, when we experience pain, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, etc., instead of looking for the fire and addressing it, guess what we do? We take out the batteries from the smoke alarm. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to feel. And so what we're doing is we're just numbing the pain. We're trying to escape. And people use different ways to escape, by the way. People take out the batteries through drugs, alcohol, people pleasing. People pleasing is a trauma response. People pleasing is a way to escape pain. It's when I don't feel worthy and I need to make sure that people like me so that I can feel worthy. People take out the batteries and numb their pain through staying really busy so I don't have to think about my pain. Or hiding in social media. There's a lot of ways that people hide from their pain. Or putting up a filter, right? There's a filter for everything. You got problems? Just put up a filter, so that at least it looks like you have a perfect family, a perfect marriage, perfect children. If you have flaws, just use a filter. These are all ways to numb pain. Addictions, the root cause of addictions is actually unhealed pain and trauma. And it's looking for a way to numb that. So here's what my advice is. I can't go through the whole book in 30 seconds, but my advice is to get the book, share it with people who you think it can benefit, as well as Reclaim Your Heart, which talks about the root cause of suffering from a spiritual perspective. But basically, sometimes we're suffering because of old trauma, and sometimes we're suffering simply because our house is on fire. It's not rocket science. We ask, why am I depressed all the time? Why am I anxious? Well, if your house is on fire, you're probably going to be anxious and depressed. And so sometimes our environment is the problem. Sometimes it's stuff from the past. Sometimes it's stuff from the present that we need to change. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us all heal and to break these cycles and to make it easy for us to raise our children as strong, resilient believers, not in shame, but in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.